but I got a question for you about some other drama that happened. And going back now to UFC 9, I'm sure you might know where I'm headed already, and that's the super fight with Ken Shamrock and Dan Severn, the rematch between those guys from UFC 6. And UFC 9, it's been regarded as pretty much the worst fight in the history of the UFC. And I've heard the story told by Ken, I've heard it told by Dan Severn, I've heard it from Big John, I even got Bob Marwitz to tell me, his side of what happened. And I'd love to hear your side on what actually happened that led up to the whole craziness at UFC 9, and what happened backstage before and after that fight.
Well, what's interesting about UFC 9, you're talking about Motor City Madness, actually,
yes.
The one we did in Detroit. And Severn split decision over Shamrock in 30 minutes. The pay-per-view numbers went down the next show. Obviously, there was a fight. Campbell McLaren says today that Bob's love of Severn and Shamrock was one of the things that led the UFC to slowing down rather than speeding up. But it was a negative. Shamrock had been followed that week by Sports Illustrated. They were doing a story on him and Bob Shamrock and his school for boys. And Shamrock was being, told by these reporters that, he was kind of a role model for kids now that, he himself had been adopted and, Bob Shamrock was running kind of a boys' home, Spencer Tracy boys' home, and that he was a role model. And that week we were under tremendous pressure from the judge who was trying to come up with a ruling whether or not we could do this event. And Bob had hired a top law firm in town to represent us. And to make a long story short, the judge said, you can do this event, but there can be no closed fist punching at all. So, Severn, I think in a radio interview, said, well, I'm going to punch. And McCarthy and I told everybody that in the dressing rooms that there would be $100 fine for every punch that you threw. And that I would collect it. It would be subtracted from your purse after the event. So that's the kind of pressure we were under. And when I think Shamrock heard that Severn said he was going to punch, and he said, well, I can't punch because, these guys from Sports Illustrated are doing a story about me that I'm the role model. If I punch and go up against the judge, I'm breaking the law. He said, I don't want to do that. So, before the fight, and Marowitz will tell you this, because at one point he and I and David Isaacs are in the hotel room, and Ken is there with Tina, and Ken is very emotional. I mean, he's red-eyed emotional, and he doesn't want to fight. He doesn't want to fight now. So Bob finally said to him, he says, Ken, I can't make you fight. We've done everything we can. And we all left. Ken finally decided to come around. I don't know what Ken's version of the story is, but that's what I remember. And I remember being called to his hotel room to talk to him. David Isaacs came a little later, and Bob showed up, and we were all trying to convince Ken to fight. And this issue of the closed fist punches was the one that, at the press conference on Thursday, Dave Benito backed out, telling me he had a broken hand. So at the press conference, Mark Schultz comes over to say hello to me. He'd never met me, he said, and we got talking, and he said, I could beat that guy Goodridge. Gary Goodridge, I could beat him. The guy Benito was going to fight. I said, really? I said, how would you like to beat him tomorrow night? He said, what do you mean? I said, well, how would you like to fight him? I said, Benito's out. I don't know if I want to put the alternate in. I said, how about if I could get you a deal? I went over and talked to Semaphore, and Bob Marowitz agreed to a certain amount of money. And we offered him $50,000 for one fight.
Wow.
And I stayed up with him that night. I had to talk to his wife and convince her in Salt Lake City. And then I had to talk to the president of Brigham Young University and convince him that it was going to be okay for him to do this event. And then the next morning, I got up early, went to his hotel room, and took him over for his AIDS test and his hepatitis B and C test. And all he had with him was a T-shirt from Negro Sour School, some flip-flops, pairs of shorts, and a pair of jeans and a pair of boots, and a striped shirt, a plaid shirt. That was it. And we got him all set up. We got him some fighting gear. We got him. Some friends helped out, and we got him his medical test. And he went in, and he threw 41 punches, close fist. He mounted at 182 pounds. He met the 260-pound Gary Goodridge, and he beat Gary. And it's the only event he ever did. But he took that money, I think, and bought a nice house in West Jordan, Utah.
I was always curious about Schultz because he had such an amazing debut against Goodridge, where he just dismantled him completely. Was there a reason that he never wanted to fight again in the UFC, or was it just money, or was he just not interested?
But you got to remember, Matthew, he was a wrestling coach at Brigham Young University, and he didn't want to lose that job. And I think that after they saw that fight, and then the controversy about Detroit, remember that in Monday morning, I think I still got the newspaper, there was a headline that said, "Promoters flee town," and it was some sort of a warrant for my arrest if I return.
You were an outlaw.
So I was an outlaw. I think the pressure for a guy like Schultz, he was, Brigham Young's a good school, so it's an LDS school, Saturday Saints, Schultz is LDS. I had to talk to the president of the college on that night, Thursday night, and reassure him that, this was a sporting event. It was a full contact sporting event. Mark was qualified, blah, blah, blah. But I think after the world saw, after the people in Utah saw that event, I think there was pressure on him to concentrate on being a coach. He never came back.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. See, he looked so great. But moving on, I guess now, as you mentioned, you were a matchmaker for the UFC once SEG bought out the stock, your stock in the company. So, as a matchmaker for the UFC and commissioner of the IFC, were there any dream fights with the regular roster of UFC fighters that you had available that you always wanted to book but were never able to do?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I think that most of them got done. Belfort versus Couture. Maurice Smith versus Tank Abbott. I think there was some fights with Coleman. I would have liked to have seen Coleman and Kerr. I would have liked to have seen Coleman and Hickson Gracie. But sometimes you don't get the. Dana probably has that same problem today. There are some fights that you'd like to make, and for a number of reasons, it just can't be done, or it can't be done today, or it may not be done tomorrow. This happens.
All right, well, I got a few more questions for you, and that's related to some modern mixed martial arts. And since you mentioned Dana, I guess the first thing I should ask is, what are your thoughts on Dana White and the way he runs the UFC? With the way he handles press and the way he talks to press, as well as the way he works with fighters. Is he the right face for pushing the sport in the right direction?
I think that you have to say that based upon the success that he is, I think he's colorful. You can't ignore Dana. He's controversial. He's colorful. He's as interesting as Vince McMahon. As interesting as Don King. And I think that has been a real plus for the UFC in the sense that they have a spokesperson who has maybe become as big as the sport in some respects. Does it engender people who dislike him? Sure, I think there's fans out there and fighters and managers that probably can tell you stories. They don't like him and they don't like what he does. But I think that the success of the UFC is its own reason at this point, and its own reason for being. They've taken it into the mainstream. The 7-year deal with Fox, they're going into and women's MMA. At one time he said he'd never do that. I think that showed a great deal of pragmatism and flexibility on his part and Lorenzo and Frank's part, that they wound up promoting women's MMA. And I think that's been a good thing. So, they've done the perfect job. They've done a very good job because the success of their business tells you that they've made a lot more right decisions than wrong decisions, that's for sure.
Now, you mentioned women's mixed martial arts. Back when you were still with the UFC, did you ever have any thoughts about promoting women fighting in mixed martial arts, or were you mostly focused on just getting men in the cage?
Well, a couple of things there. That's a good question. I saw that women's boxing didn't have a great reservoir, a great reserve base of fighters to draw from. And that by and large, you couldn't build a complete boxing card based on women's fighters. They represented, kind of an alternative thing that you could add to a card. And I was concerned that would have been the case in mixed martial arts, is that the resource base, the amount of fighters available would be much smaller than the male base, and that therefore it would be a problem on some level. To some extent, we probably could make that point still today, that for every 10 mixed martial arts male fighters, how many females are there by comparison? The other issue, too, Matthew, is at the time, we were under such attack for being barbaric and human cockfighting that, quite frankly, considering bringing women in would have only added to my problems.
That's very true. Are you a fan of modern women's mixed martial arts?
Yeah, I am, and I've made interview statements to the effect that what MMA needs is 5 more Ronda Rouseys. I think Ronda is a real plus. I think she's a star. She's got charisma. I like the fact that she pulls people away from the side of the octagon and she wins this thing in the center. She's got a style that works for her, and she's got skills that are incredible, and she's an attractive girl. So, you know, am I a fan of Ronda Rousey? Absolutely. I think the sport needs a couple more like her. I've said in interviews that what the sport needs is a Muhammad Ali, an athlete that even transcends the sport. But there are still people in the mainstream that still consider this marginal. It's a smaller number than it used to be. But I still run into people who say, well, is that like Tough Man? You know, referring to Art Davie's boxing thing 20 years ago. I said, no, it's not Tough Man. And some people who know what I did, or know what I've done, said to me, that Ultimate Fighting, is that still around? And you think to yourself, don't you read the newspaper? Don't you look on the internet? Don't you see TV commercials? So I think that the sport still has more room to grow. And I'm excited about what may happen in the next 20 years. Can you imagine what mixed martial arts will be like 20 years from today? John Milley is tonight to talk about the fact that eventually you'd have 50 million people one night watching this on the internet, watching some championship. It's coming. I'm excited about the fact that from Norway to Thailand, from China to Argentina, there's mixed martial arts. Other than soccer, it's the one physical activity that young people all over the world can relate to. Because every country's got some version of it, some history with it, some cultural basis in it. And mixed martial arts has become the focal point to bring all of this together. So, can you imagine what it'll be like 20 years from today? Incredible.